And Ranking Member Capiano, thank you for holding this hearing today and for all of your assistance in the wake of this unthinkable tragedy which struck in my district on the morning of December 18th. It was a quiet Monday morning when Amtrak Cascades 501 derailed as it approached the Mounts Road Bridge in DuPont, Washington. The locomotive and passenger cars were sent flying down onto Interstate 5 below at nearly 80 miles per hour into the path of motorists who were going about their morning commute. 3 people were killed in that commute, 3 passengers on that train: Jim Hamry, Zach Wilhoit, and Benjamin Graham. Jim and Zach were my constituents. They were also fierce advocates. That's why they were on the train, which was the inaugural Amtrak service on the new Point Defiance bypass. Jim was a retired civil engineer, while Zach worked for Pierce Transit. As a board member of the Rail Passengers Association, Jim had actually visited me in Washington, D.C., sat in my office to advocate for expanding passenger train service. The entire South Puget Sound continues to mourn the loss of these 3 individuals. But they were not the only victims of this tragedy. 70 passengers and motorists were injured. And by the way, that included a delightful young woman named Maddie, who happens to be the niece of one of my staff members. It's only thanks to the heroic work of the first responders and bystanders and doctors that the injured are still with us today. And I want to particularly commend the active duty service members and civilians at nearby Joint Base Lewis McChord who rushed to help. We're here today because we know this tragedy could have been avoided if positive train control was active on the route. The NTSB has recommended that railroads install PTC for nearly 50 years. I'm glad we have NTSB Chairman Robert Sumwalt with us today, and I want to thank them for all of their assistance. But despite these consistent warnings, there's been an absolute failure to heed them. And it's a collective failure on the part of the Federal Railroad Administration, but also on the part of Congress, which has failed to meaningfully fund PTC implementation and enforce deadlines. There are no excuses to be made here today. The Amtrak Cascades crash was preventable, as were over 150 other rail accidents the NTSB has investigated. That's why I support legislation from Ranking Members DeFazio and Capiano, which would provide the funding railroads across the country need to complete PTC on their routes. I met on Monday with the head of the Washington State Department of Transportation, Roger Millar, and I was glad to hear that the Amtrak Cascade route is on schedule to have PTC implementation by the current deadline of December 2018. And the same goes for the freight railroads in my district. But that's not the case for many railroads across our country. That's why, most importantly, the bill would prevent the U.S. Department of Transportation from extending the PTC deadline. Passing this legislation would send a clear message that there is no need for us ever to have this conversation again. No delays, no excuses. For Jim Hamry, Zach Wilhoit, and Benjamin Graham, I ask this committee and the Congress to act to prevent a crash like Amtrak Cascades 501 from ever happening in this country again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Heck.